Also in cash markets are thinning and some of them disappearing. In a lot of agricultural markets, cash markets in the United States and throughout the world, there's both monopoly, seller power being exerted by big corporations, and also buyer power. And another influence is through the rules of the game, through political influence. The contemporary lord, tying back to Rod's presentation, is a transnational corporation who the U.S. Supreme Court says is a person. And this personhood goes back to the 1800s, and there were several Supreme Court opinions or decisions that strengthen that, leading up to Citizens United in 2010 that said corporations are people. They can make all the political contributions they want. What were they thinking? Corporation's not a person. Person's a person. And somebody, I don't know who, put this together after the Citizens United decision. You can tell the 5 justices that voted for Citizens United, they have on their corporate robes, like in NASCAR racing and other things, with all of the logos. Corporate power. Out of the 100 largest economic entities nowadays throughout the world, 37 are governments, and 63 are corporations. Hear a lot about Russia these days. Russia's number 15 on the list. Walmart's ahead of Russia, number 12 in terms of their size and magnitude. So there are a lot of economic, social, political issues, and I'm going to try to take a very broad brush treatment, as objective as I can make it, but I'm not free of value judgments. I'm going to start with some quotations. Never started this way before, then a framework discussion, and then get back to agriculture. This is The Economist, which is a weekly magazine, pretty much mainstream. Rod reads it every week. I read it some, not as much as Rod. 2003, they said a system that gives charter to brazen, unchecked greed is a system in peril. Well, greed's good. Some say. The movie Wall Street. Continuing with The Economist, in economics, the most potent checking force, bar none, is competition. Bosses, shareholders, and pro-business politicians loathe it. They don't want competition. They want to get rid of competition. As a result, there have been many agricultural cartels throughout history, going back centuries. This particular one was Archer Daniels, Midland, and others fixing the price of synthetic glycine and vitamins and other things. A movie made out of it called The Informant. Quoting from the movie, corn goes in one end, profits come out the other end. Over 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to sit in a Birmingham law office for a few days, going through all of the discovery documents in this case, including about 200 audio and some videotapes of the executives getting together in plush international resorts to fix prices. That really opened my eyes to what was going on in the agricultural economy. They paid a lot of fines and had big legal fees. 3 individuals went to prison for, white-collar prison, for short terms. But with the super high prices they had fixed, even after all of that, they still made money. Greed's good. Supreme Court Justice, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. Another Supreme Court Justice, the growth of bigness has resulted in ruthless sacrifices of human values. The disappearance of free enterprise has submerged the individual in the impersonal corporation. When a nation of shopkeepers is transformed into a nation of clerks, enormous spiritual sacrifices. Some people view Adam Smith as a patron saint of free markets. By the way, there's no such thing as a free market, but that's another topic. Adam Smith felt strongly about monopolies. To widen the market and to narrow the competition is always the interest of the dealers. Now we'd call them corporate executives, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. Adam Smith, 250 years ago. A French economist in 1850 talked about the law being perverted and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose but made to follow entirely contrary purpose. The law becomes the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself is guilty of the evils it's supposed to punish. He referred to this as legal plunder. Only a small group of lawmakers practices legal plunder, but that may set in motion a process in which the plundered classes, rather than seeking to abolish the perversion of law, instead want to get in on it. And so lawful plunder. John Kenneth Galbraith, a famous economist who wrote extensively, we've reached a point, this was the last book he wrote, one of the last things he said in 2004. We've reached a point where the private sector has unprecedented control over the public sector. We've given ourselves over to self-serving belief and contrived nonsense, or more simply, fraud. This has come at the expense of the economy, effective government, and the business world. And on the light side, Will Rogers, humorist, we're living in the age of mergers and combines. When your business is not doing good, you combine with something and sell more stock. Like Bayer's acquisition of Monsanto. Now talk about comparative economic, social, political systems. And I'm going to use a visual aid developed by a non-academic friend in Wyoming, Terry Stevenson. This looks at the balance between business and government. This is Terry in the middle of this picture performing a wedding ceremony. This is a circle he came up with. He color-coded it. At the very top, you have a balance of power. You have honesty and competition. Balance of power between government and business. You can slide down from the top and go down the blue side. Rod's been down that side growing up in Cuba. Definitely been down that side. And you can get down to the bottom, which can be socialism, communism, feudalism. Or you can go down the right side where business totally dominates government. And that leads to fascism, feudalism, various other kinds. And so Terry said, well, this really should be a sphere because you can go down many different sides in many different ways. But to connect with the Columbian Exchange, slavery and serfdom may occur at many points on the circle or inside the circle. And as Terry said, the only place to be is at the very top. I could tell a lot of stories about Terry and his brothers. They grew up on a ranch, a big ranch, And they were having trouble with a bear, a 400-pound bear, killing their livestock. And his brother Randy was out on horseback one day and saw the bear at a distance, and Randy decided he was going to rope the bear. He had a 20-foot rope and got within about 25 feet of the bear, and the horse decided he didn't want anything to do with that bear. Another brother was on foot chasing the bear, armed with nothing more than a pocket knife. Terry's the intellectual of the group, who has a master's degree in theology from highly conservative Denver Baptist College. Here's my own personal view, that during my 72 years, we started kind of at the top of the circle and sort of slid along the red side of that and suddenly went into a free fall. And to me, this is oversimplified, but to me, that turning point when we went into a free fall was Citizens United decision that allowed all of the dark money, all of the corporate money to come into our political system with all parties. And back to the NASCAR robes. You get to discussing different economic systems, sometimes even in academic circles, and there's socialism and there's capitalism. In truth, there are many forms of socialism, many different forms of capitalism. And again, slavery and serfdom can be a part of some of these. Now for ag overview, I'm going to give a quick descriptive summary. We've had massive consolidation in the world agricultural sector during my life, and especially during the last 2 or 3 decades. Part of it is horizontal at one level of industry, such as beef slaughter or poultry processing. Massive consolidation horizontally, and this is happening throughout the world economy, not just agriculture. But we can also have vertical integration or vertical coordination, supply chains that go from a farmer all the way up through processing, wholesaling, retailing up to a final consumer. So we've had both of those. There can be advantages to that, but it can also be a deadly combination. Are there efficiency gains associated with horizontal consolidation and vertical integration? Quite often. But there's also more market power and more profit put on to the cost of production. May be bad, may be good, it depends. We talk about monopoly, or oligopoly means a few. And in common discussions, we talk about monopoly power, but in agriculture in particular, it's important to distinguish between seller power or monopoly power and buyer power. The economic jargon for that is monopsony or oligopsony. And a problem is that political power often accompanies economic power. A lot of sustainability issues, 4 firm concentration ratios, and some ag industries. This is the share of a market held by the 4 largest firms. 45% in food retailing and growing rapidly, especially when Walmart entered the retail food or grocery business. 85% cattle slaughter, just go down the list. Highly concentrated horizontally. Many of these exceed the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission threshold where competition concerns are highly likely. Since 1980, for all practical purposes, Department of Justice and FTC have not seen a merger they didn't like. They just rubber stamp them, and leads to more and more concentration, more and more market power. Uh, brief summary of agriculture. Cropland held by farms with at least 2,000 acres. It was 15% in 1987. It's now approaching 40%. Absentee ownership of farmland is growing. It's over half of the cropland in the Midwest, corn and soybeans, or the wiregrass, peanuts, and cotton. It's even higher than that. Absentee ownership of ag land. Foreign ownership, it's reported to be about 30 million acres, but it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to trace. The land report says the 100 largest landowners own 27 million acres in 2017, up 50% from a decade earlier. Institutional ownership. A lot of institutions have big cash portfolios. Universities, insurance companies, all kinds of things. And REIT, investment trust. In farmland, it's less than 1%, but growing rapidly. Vertical control in a market can occur in two ways. One is through direct ownership. The other is through contracting. We have both of those in agriculture, but the integrator, the company doing the integrating, can be at any level in a vertical chain from farmer up to a consumer. In a lot of ag, it's at the processing, wholesaling level. With broilers, the integrator is the processor. Started out with feed companies, but then the feed companies became processors. But now Costco, a retailer, is now integrating into broiler production and processing in Nebraska. It's highly controversial there, but they're well along the way to doing that. So a retailer becomes the integrator. Industrial farming, if you're not familiar with it, these are poultry houses. Each one of those has 20,000 square feet, 50 by 400 feet, longer than a football field. And those are getting even larger now. That's inside a poultry house. It's becoming a global issue. As The Guardian stated a couple of years ago, the U.S. model of farming is invading the world. So we have this going on in Europe, China, South America, a lot of other places. So it's not just the United States. Hog houses, the poultry industry integrated in the 1950s over about a 2-year period. And for a long, long time, it worked well for the integrator and for the contract grower. That has changed. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, the hog and pork industry has adopted the poultry model. And for decades, the poultry model is the one held up for all ag business to emulate that particular system. These are hog houses. Over on the left, that is an open lagoon. And the waste from that is sprayed on fields. There's nothing that smells worse than hog waste. There were many times when Mother made me take my clothes off out on the back porch before I come in the house so I wouldn't bring the smell of pigs inside. I guess the only farm animal that would run a second to it, and it's not very second, is goat sweat. That smells pretty bad. The hog waste smells really bad. Ma'am, you had a question?
A comment. That contract that we saw
Mm-hmm.
that had the inserted term that they were independent.
Yes.
That means that even though this is the system that is required to do the supplies for these big companies,
Right.
the waste and any environmental contracts consequences lie with the independent.
Yes. And
And there's no responsibility of the big corporation.
they say they're not responsible, the big corporation. Another long story in the poultry industry, the contracts up until, sometime in the early 1990s said nothing about waste. The farmers have always been allowed to use it, and if it's needed, it's a positive. If there's too much of it, it's a negative. The recent contracts that the growers had no say in says that the grower, the farmer, is responsible for meeting all state, local, federal, environmental, and health regulations. But the grower doesn't own the bird, the grower doesn't own the feed, and the contracts do not explicitly say from a legal standpoint that the grower owns the waste. They're allowed to use it, which gets into a legal gray area. Rod mentioned I'm an Okie. I've been here for 31 years. I was in Oklahoma only 21, Rod. The state of Oklahoma sued the poultry integrators, not the growers, for alleged pollution of the scenic Illinois River watershed in northeastern Oklahoma. The reason the state sued the integrators is the problem was upstream in Arkansas, where the poultry operations were much, much more intense than in Oklahoma. That became very political. It's a whole bunch of them up there in Benton and Washington County, Arkansas. Tyson, yes, is one of the big ones, but they're most of the others. Not all, but most, including Cal-Maine egg producer. That was, they had a trial, a bench trial, meaning the judge is the jury, that went on for months. And that was over going on 10 years ago. The judge has never issued a verdict and never will, in my opinion.
And the solution continues.
Yeah.
Well, they come down pretty hard on the producers.
Yes, they do. And, well, yes. And where some manipulation has gone on is partly through the contract wording, but also through the regs that Charlie mentioned. All of the regs and everything apply to an individual farm. Best management practices and everything they have to do. Generally, like in the Illinois River watershed, the problem is not any single farm. It's the totality of all of it. And that's where the integrators say, we're not responsible. Well, you decided to locate them all there. You own the bird and the feed. Why don't you own what comes out the other end? Yes, sir. by most states and the feds. There have been battles going on in a lot of states over the ag-gag laws. The independents in Oklahoma beat down the integrators, and some in other states are being legally challenged, but no, you cannot go in. And the companies will say it's because of biosecurity reasons we won't let you go in the house. There's some truth to that, but they're using that quite often as an excuse to keep people out. And no, when you see a picture of the inside of a poultry house made in the last 10 years, it was probably illegal. But you can find a lot of them on YouTube. The big lagoon over on the left, and this is inside of one of those hog barns. This is what happened when a hurricane comes in North Carolina last fall. This is the second time it happened. It happened in the mid-1990s, and there were some state regulations and other things to try to prevent it. But you can see it didn't. 100-year floodplain. Charlie? Well, yeah. The flush, Charlie mentioned. This is a satellite photo of the coastal area of North Carolina right after the hurricane. You can get one from a month or so before the hurricane, and you don't see all of those plumes. That's runoff of organic matter, poultry waste, livestock waste, human waste, all of that. And, you know, Charlie can tell you a lot about the consequences of that. So, contract farming, poultry, 95+% of poultry production is under contract. They're very one-sided. In many areas, there is only one integrator in the area because they will not contract with anybody that's more than 40 or 50 miles from processing plant and feed mill. So there's only one contractor around. Individuals get pulled into this. They have a economic life on a poultry house of 20 to 40 years. They go to the bank and get a loan insured by either FSA or small business loans through the government. Bank doesn't have much risk. They get these loans, but there's an economic payback of very long time. The contracts, some of the recent contracts say this applies 7 years or 15 years. Well, the person who wrote the contract can change it tomorrow. More importantly, if you carefully read the contracting, it assures the grower of only one flock of chicks, which they will have 40 to 60 days. So if the integrator decides, I don't need your production, they walk. The grower is left with a huge loan at the bank. No alternative use for these highly specialized, huge poultry houses, except in a few isolated cases. They're bankrupt instantly. And because of that power, there's a lot of fear in the industry. Who owns what? On the left side, Big Meat owns the genetics, the birds, the feed, the medicine, the trucks, the slaughter facility, all of the branding. The grower has the debt. 5 poultry houses is full-time work for one person. 5 new poultry houses would cost about $1 million today. They provide the labor, which means clean up the mess and take out dead birds. They have to pay the utilities, and they have the waste and the dead birds and any environmental consequence of that. Showed a picture of Craig Watts earlier. He was one of Purdue's top growers. He spoke out about surf conditions of contract farming. He's now out of business. And there are many others. Here are links to a lot of videos about this. The second link up there shows the industry response that, oh, those are isolated growers. They're just making this up. There are no problems. Everybody's happy. It's a wonderful system and so forth. Form your own judgment. The hog and pork industry's been chickenized. In this case, the integrator owns the genetics and typically the sows. Smithfield, located primarily in North Carolina, the headquarters, they own almost 1 million sows now. They own almost 1 million sows. And to tie back to some questions or comments, Smithfield is now owned by the Chinese. They're exporting pork produced here over to China, and they're leaving the waste and the smell and any environmental problems here. The taxpayers will probably end up picking up the expense. Unlike the poultry industry, the hog industry, Smithfield and others own some of the hog finishing facilities. Yes, sir?
What percent of these sows total sows are owned by the Chinese?
Directly, it would be, as far as I know, I don't know of any other large ones owned by the Chinese, so this would be 20-25%. I can get a number for you later, but that's pretty close. Power imbalance in the broiler industry. The 4 largest firms, Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, and a couple of others, have a total of 43% of the market for processed chicken. The key thing is that in a lot of areas, there's only one integrator. It's pure textbook monopsony. No one else to contract with. And so grower contracts are not negotiable in legal terms. It's a contract of adhesion, meaning that that grower is, from a legal standpoint, an employee of the company. But that body of law has not been used for a variety of reasons. But still, in legal terms, it's contract of adhesion. We have highly complex business structure. Corporations have vast wingspans. I call them spider webs. Very complex business organizations. Subsidiaries of subsidiaries, joint ventures, and all kinds of things, partial ownership, interlocking corporate directorships. Some are quasi-government companies, family ownership of connected businesses. All of those textbook economic models that I love and lectured about for over 40 years don't apply very well to this highly complex structure. Ma'am?
Yesterday afternoon, I heard on Marketplace about something I was unaware of, and I'm sure I should have been aware, but that stockholders, you don't vote one share, one vote, that they now have in corporate structure super shares. In some cases, there are no votes connected to the shares that you own, and a few of the stockholders have all of the votes. So even the stockholders have no power at all in this current structure of a lot of these corporations.
I don't have detailed knowledge about all of that, but yes, I agree with you that the shareholders, the small shareholders, have almost no power. A few of the big ones do. Occasionally they'll jerk the chain for the executives, but Doesn't happen very often. So, yeah, that's a related issue. So these textbook models are not just not very good in understanding this. I'm not going to go over all this slide. The point is, this is a seed industry structure now. And this has all happened in the last 35 years, pretty much. The big one is Bayer. They acquired Monsanto, and antitrust authorities required them to spin off part of that to BASF, Corteva, over here, ChemChina, Syngenta. And all of those circles are companies or whatever that they own or control. That's not like textbook economics where you have a single firm that's maximizing profit and all of that. It's very hard to fully understand. The organic food industry really took off. It was started by small farmers who developed organic production practices and standards and developed a market for organic products. It's now taken over by the corporate world. And you can see some of the complexity.
I take issue with that. I think it was developed by the Organic Act by USDA, creating the organic foods, that program. Because that is what really started the organic food industry there. Is that the government is involved in something it really shouldn't be involved in.
We'll get to that shortly, okay. And notice all these brands. In the center, you have the companies, Coca-Cola and so forth. Highly complex. Illusion of choice in grocery stores. 80% of all these cereals are accounted for by just 4 companies. Bacon. Go to the grocery store here. I know Kroger, Publix, whichever one. There's a big shelf with just bacon on it. It's essentially from the same hog because they're growing one genotype of pig raised in essentially the same way for almost all of those, including the house brands. And if you buy pork or bacon here in the southeast, 90% of it's going to come from Smithfield, 10% from some other integrated producers. For all practical purposes, there's no cash market for pigs that have been fed out to slaughter weight. Has not been a cash market for broilers for decades. Smithfield brands, including all of the house brands, and on the back of the package, Kroger or Publix just say it's packaged for Kroger. It doesn't tell you any longer where that comes from. Recently had a big recall. JBS, the world's largest meat company, owned by the Brazilians. They bought Pilgrim's Pride Poultry in bankruptcy court in the U.S., so they own Pilgrim's Pride. Had a lot of salmonella. There were 13 brands that were actually involved, and not one that says JBS. And you can see Kroger and Walmart are there. The firm doesn't have a stellar reputation. The executives, some of them have been arrested in Brazil for corruption and other crimes. Still going on. And JBS was caught exporting rotten beef worldwide a couple of years ago, and they tried to cover up the stench with various chemicals. Deceptive labeling. You go get a steak and look on it, it'll say product of USA. all that means is that it was put in a package in the United States. It can be from anywhere. This is something that the transnational corporations have pushed through the government. After a lengthy battle, industry defeated country of origin labeling. For a short time, you'd see a label on beef that says born, raised, processed in the United States of America. That's been killed, and this is what you have, product of the USA. Doesn't mean anything, except it was packaged here. Deceptive labeling. ABC News called it pink slime. Recently, USDA says it can be labeled ground beef. There's been litigation going over this for some time. It is a process fairly recent that a single company developed for taking that little tissue that's left on bones after processing. They get that tissue off, and that's where the pink slime came from. Some industry people think that's unfair, but it can be labeled ground beef. Now, I noticed recently that seafood mislabeling in Ontario, 32% of samples were mislabeled, 17% at the import stage, 27% at the processing plants, and 38% at the retailers. There's been an ongoing flab in the United States over what constitutes a catfish. Alabama and Mississippi are the two largest states in farm-raised catfish. But something was being imported from other parts of the world and called catfish. So there are a lot of issues there. I don't know if it's as bad in the United States. Misunderstood labels. Some people think that when you see USDA choice or prime on a steak, it means U.S. No, it's just a grade assigned by us. And you see certified Angus growing. Well, a black eye and the black hair are kind of dominant genes when you start crossing cattle. So some of the Angus is indeed purebred and certified. Some may not be. Whoops. Antitrust issues. We have antitrust laws in the United States that came about because of the robber barons in the late 1800s. The Sherman Act and followed up by the Clayton Act. In the government building in Washington that houses the whole Department of Justice, the big doorways leading into the complex, there are murals there, and one mural depicts this: problems, railroads, shipping, meat packing. Way back then. But since 1980, the antitrust laws regarding mergers and acquisitions really have not been enforced, and it's allowed for all of this growth. I like this. Art Buchwald, the humorist, most of you probably remember a book he wrote. You may not have heard about the proposed merger of Sampson Securities and Delilah Company. The announcement reads, I would like to announce that Sampson and Delilah, the only companies left, are now negotiating at the White House with the president to buy the United States. The Department of Justice will naturally study this merger to see if it violates our strong antitrust laws. Well, 1977. Political power tends to follow economic power. And when the transnational companies get power, they naturally try to make all of the rules in their favor. And you can lose competition. It would be like in an Auburn-Alabama football game. If you didn't have rules, or one side wrote the rules and one side owned the referees, it would not be a competitive football game. Agency capture, a term from economics, often referred to as a revolving door in Washington, with lobbyists, executives, and high-ranking government employees. In agriculture, 57% of the lobbyists were revolvers. And a cartoon showing the revolving door, but a syndicated ag writer friend says, there's no door, it's a big wide hallway with people going both directions. The door was torn down long ago. Rod, do we need to stop for a few minutes? We can stop. Well, you have a 5-minute break? Okay. Then I'll go on from here. We'll move along. And to repeat a slide about corporate power, 63 of the 100 largest economic entities in the world are corporations, and only 37 governments. This is a cartoon that shows some income effects. Cartoon by Rick Friday. I wish there was more profit in farming. The guy says, there is. In year 2015, the CEOs of Monsanto, DuPont, and John Deere combined made more money than 2,129 Iowa farmers. Friday had been a cartoonist for several Iowa papers for 20 years. A company reported to be Monsanto got him fired because of this cartoon. It backfired. They made him famous. A year later, the newspapers hired Friday back with public apology for firing him. I'm sure they lost all their subscribers. They had to. And so he's back, and he's got some other gigs. He's on Facebook. It's really interesting, but adverse implication for farmers, this deadly combination of horizontal concentration and vertical integration. A law prof friend at Wisconsin likes to say the American farmer is caught in an economic vice, getting squeezed on both sides. I tell him he spelled it wrong. It should be V-I-C-E. But it's a monopoly power of the suppliers, the seed companies, tractor companies, and so forth on one side, and the buyer power on the other side. With the GMOs, genetically modified seed, which is most of the acreage in the United States is planted to that. If you have a good lawyer, carefully read all of the fine print on the back of a seed bag, which farmers don't really have time to read when they're planting. But it says the farmer does not own the crop. They own the right to market the crop under certain conditions, but they don't even own it anymore. And you see the image, the pastoral image of the farm family being used a lot. There are a lot of those farmers still around and farm families, but sometimes it's just identity theft. This is a more recent Friday cartoon showing what's happening to family farms with the sharks of weather, global trade, corporate lack of competition, and input cost swimming around. Not much ground to stand on anymore. Potentially adverse implications for consumers, predatory practices toward alternative food system, which can reduce choice. impacts of industrial farming on nutritional quality of food. I'm not an expert in that area, but that's something that could be talked about at length. Exercise of political power, and also subtle infiltration and control of traditional ag organizations. I won't mention any by name, but some of those are now controlled, and then there's just outright fraud in the food system. These broad issues dealing with liberty, serfdom with a mortgage, the trade-off between economies of size and potentially abusive economic power, the environmental ones that we talked briefly about, political imbalanced influence on the rules of the game, the rules of the marketplace and enforcement of those rules, sustainability, other issues. Industrial farming is highly dependent on mine fertilizer and water and fossil fuel. Pest resistance issue, loss of prime farmland to urban developments. A lot of issues there. This is a question. Who should make rules and regulations regarding food and food markets? We the people or a select few? Are the referees, the antitrust and food safety police independent? Will the referees throw flags with penalties sufficient to change behavior? Okay. Well, that is an issue. The real turning point was when the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed universities, historically land-grant universities like Auburn had extensive plant breeding programs going on, traditional plant breeding, or even genetic modification, but the patent remained with the university and in the public domain. This Bayh-Dole Act that allowed small and mid-sized companies to cut deals with universities for research. And that was extended to allow large corporations to cut deals with universities in 1980, 1984, I forget. I think it was 84. But when that happened, it allowed these companies to essentially take all of the seed and the genetics that had been in the public domain and pull that into their own private label. The Alabama Crop Improvement Building that Rod and I were housed in for 15 years or so, that was built just before, and there were big plans to, get the seed, get it in the public domain, which means farmers could save their own seed and so forth. But because the Bayh-Dole Act was extended to large universities, that building was, for all practical purposes, empty. And
another little pet of mine is the fact that all of the varieties, and there have been hundreds of varieties released by Auburn University over the years in the public domain, none of them are available today.
right.
Because the companies have paid Auburn for those rights, and then they shelve those seeds and don't.
They won't do anything with them. Exactly. So, yeah, that.
Millions of your dollars have gone into paying plant breeders at Auburn to produce public seeds that are not in the public domain.
And the benefits are now captured by the corporations.
Say something that I had read about Alabama sometime ago, and it relates to what was talked about of how this sort of relates to slavery and
And it was letters written by a young girl who grew up during the Civil War, and how they, raised chickens, and they ate pretty well. They got by, they didn't have a lot of crops. But it talked about the fact that the people that hurt the most was the large slave owners, because they couldn't grow crops because all of the seed companies were in the north. And so you had all these, in some cases, maybe 100 slaves, and they couldn't really grow crops even to support themselves. That's sort of the kind of situation you got control over.
And markets for the crops too. Yes, it's very complicated.
We don't know exactly how things will go
To paraphrase Justice Douglas, when a nation of farmers is transformed into a nation of hog house janitors, enormous spiritual sacrifices are made. It's basically all a hog producer or a poultry producer does now. I know it has a very negative connotation. Some of them use it, but where do you want to be? And if you agree that we've been in a free fall since 2010, can we find a rope and slowly climb back up to the top? It's going to be a tough climb. Rod's addition to my slide, and there was 20 years ago a assistant to one of the Auburn administrators that when she saw Rod and I coming, it was Jekyll and Hyde or Heckle and Jekyll. There's been a price on our head for some time, but we're proud of this. So again, my thought and Rod's thought is to stimulate discussion and thought on these topics that we think are very important. Where we live now, so many people have a belief and they state it. They're not budging. They won't give their reasons. It's just, I believe this. Another group, I believe this. And the one thing I think we need to do to work our way out is to start discussing these important issues.
Don't confuse me with the facts.
Right. All the way in back first. No, go ahead, sir.
Just so I understand about the seeds, the seller owns the seeds, so the farmer could not get seeds from plants and then replant next year.
That is correct. And if they're caught, the big companies will file suit against them. And, an old adage is the color of justice is green, meaning money. The big corporations have the money to hire the big expensive lawyers to take on a farmer that doesn't have equivalent legal representation. There have been a lot of legal battles over that.
Just this morning, there was another story on NPR about plant-based meat. I wonder, one, you folks here that know about that, is that something that they were saying that it's almost hard to tell now? It's so well prepared or formulated.
Well, I'm not an economist, but from what I know, that is indeed possible, and it's definitely on the horizon. And Tyson and some other animal protein producers, traditional animal protein producers, have bought in big time to some of those companies. the battle in Washington now is, what do you call that? And naturally, Tyson's and JBS and the others, they won't call it beef. Not cell-based meat production. So that's a battle that's being waged right now. Oh, the cell-based meat. I remember as a kid they're talking about, won't be long before we can grow our food in a petri dish. So it's a petri dish on a big scale. So Charlie, am I? Yeah, petri, there you go. That's what we'll call it.
Your lecture today makes me think that these big companies would want to get control of that whole emerging industry or that product. So either they could, maybe like Tyson said, we maybe get some we can pass off as beef or whatever. Or they'll just leave it never done. About that.
That could well be.
I bet you one of those soy burgers were made by Cargill.
But you never get.
Yeah, no, I had one of those soy burgers in the 1970s, and yeah, it was Cargill. Ma'am.
But you couldn't find out. That's part of the scary part to me.
Yeah, you know, I don't worry about eating food I get at most restaurants and at the grocery store. And being old, I learned the sniff test. Sniff test to make sure it's good.
Something about the National Organic Program.
Oh, I didn't. It's you know more details, but you know, the organic people kind of had their own internal standards for their farm, and then got together and standardized all of this for it to be called organic and sold in the store. Certain conditions had to be met on the production process and prior use of the land and so forth. And you know, some of the small organic groups were pushing for that, but as Charlie mentioned, the big push came from the big corporations that wanted that. And at one point in time, they were pushing to make Roundup the most used herbicide in the world, fit into the organic framework. That didn't happen, but it kind of shows you what was going on. And there's more and more battle, and along the same lines is for small or even mid-size cow, poultry, hog operations that want to become vertically integrated, but small. They have trouble finding packing plants that will handle it. And even if they build their own, the argument goes is the big boys have imposed through the government system higher standards on them than they have, which makes it difficult for them to compete. So you know, either Auburn or Alabama gets to making the rules for themselves.
National Organic Program there is really no scientific basis to show that organically produced food is any better quality or different or in any way. I mean, there have been books written about it than standard produced food following the rules and regulations the USDA already has in place. But there was a big lobby to Congress, and this occurred 20, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
to pass the National Organic Program, which is a overburdening bureaucracy on the small farmer that wants to grow things organically. It's not so much on the big farmer.
No,
But the
that's
small farmer is really burdened with following
And there's a category without any rules, naturally grown.
Yeah.
You see it on a lot of different food products. And
Organically grown without.
no, but natural just has no real meaning, and there's litigation going against the corporations for using that when you take their naturally grown produce and you do a chemical analysis and you find pesticide residues and other things. What is it? So a lot of the corporate influence on the land grant research mission is growing, and it's very strong without naming a university or anything like that. And for ag faculty, during my career, Rod's career, Charlie's career, has gone from having funds to support salary, but also some hard money funds to work with to do research on new plant varieties and so forth, to only funding salaries. So it's become a grants economy. You have to go get grants. Who's got the money? The corporations have the money. And so if I'm on the faculty and I get a grant from a big corporation, they get to ask the questions that are researched. That's one issue, which may not be the issues that should be researched for the People's University. But also, if it's me and my salary is paid out of federal and state taxpayer dollars, I go over and work full-time on this grant project, which means that my salary is an implicit subsidy for corporate America in the land grant system and even on non-land grant issues. So it's very much so a real problem. Corporations don't like me. And they've talked to some administrators to that effect too. Ma'am?
Disclose something that the subsidizer didn't like, could they squelch your results publication?
They could, and they have. If the researcher has the courage to go ahead and turn it into a journal without showing it to the company, it will be published, and they'll never get another grant. But typically, the company is allowed to look at the preliminary results. And so, well, that's the way it is. Yeah, Rod and I got called to a dinner meeting at the dean's house once to talk about that particular issue with regard to another faculty, not in his department or my department, showed results to the company funding, and they jerked his chain and threatened to pull funding for graduate assistants and other things. It's pretty common. Yes.
Well, they're getting their model when the drug companies have done with state institutions, for example, higher learning, for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I first came to Auburn, we had one member on our staff that we were not part of the university, we were federal, who didn't have a PhD. And the boss wanted to have all the staff members with their terminal degree, so he won't take care of that easy enough. He'll send him up to Wisconsin, where Arlie will do a job on him. Arlie will get him that degree in 2 years.
Mm.
Well, Arlie was the only parasitologist I've ever known of who became rich by being a parasitologist. Okay, so we send Bob up there. Bob says that like this. And then they can do their own project. And Bob came back in 2 years. And the boss says, oh, you know, my Harley gets all these students and all this. He gives the drug companies what they want. And there's going to be the same case developing here. Give the ConAgra or whoever what they want. And hey, if you're a faculty member, researcher, you've got grant money coming in all the time from this private source.
And you get publications and you get higher salaries. That's, Rod says, time's up, but I'll hang around.